Okay, I think we can begin. So again, I'd like to repeat my practical announcement before we get started, and that is that everybody should have a handout. If you're just coming in now, you want to get a handout, I think, at the top of the stairs. And the purpose of that is, one, it reminds you of some of our speakers' accomplishments and the suggested readings that you should have read for today. But if you are enrolled in one of the seminars, then when you turn the paper over, you'll see that you can write in your name, check off which class you're in, and write down a comment or a question that you have, okay? If you manage to ask that comment or ask that question or make that comment today, that's great, no problem. If we don't get to you today, then we'll be able to talk about those things later in our subsequent discussion, okay? And you can give that paper either to one of your writing tutors or to your professor when you leave. Okay. It's an honor to introduce Karl Eikenberry, Ambassador and Lieutenant General of the U.S. Army, retired. General Eikenberry tells me that after so many years in the Army and government service, it is actually a relief to hear his first name spoken, so he will henceforth be Karl in my remarks. Karl has had a rich educational background. He attended West Point, graduating as a commissioned officer in 1973 while the Vietnam War was still in progress. He later earned a master's degree in East Asian Studies from Harvard, a master's degree in political science from Stanford, and degrees in Mandarin Chinese and Chinese history in Hong Kong and Nanjing. In his military career, Karl not only served as a commander of various airborne ranger and mechanized infantry units or battalions, but he also filled a number of key staff positions, such as division chief with the Strategy, Plans, and Policy Directorate of the Army staff. He served 2 tours of duty in the recent war in Afghanistan. During his first, his team worked to build the Afghan National Army, reform the Afghan police, counter opium production, and reform the judiciary system there. During his second, he was commander of the Combined Forces Command, a post that he left in 2007 to become the deputy chairman of the NATO Military Committee. In 2009, President Obama appointed him as ambassador to Afghanistan, and he is now at Stanford's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. He will be speaking to you about putting the liberal arts to public service, and he tells me, this is a hint for your question and answer period, that if you ask him how he decided to study Mandarin Chinese while he was an undergraduate, you will be rewarded with a good story.
Thanks. Thanks, Karl. Well, Professor Oxby, Blair, thank you for those very kind words of introduction. And it is a real pleasure to be here to address this gathering of a very special course of education as self-fashioning. The title of my presentation, as you know, is Putting the Liberal Arts to Public Service. So what I'd like to do is provide you with some opening thoughts here, maybe talk for about 30 or 40 minutes, and then use the remainder of the time to take your questions and to just have a conversation with you. Now, you know that, as Blair had said, I have spent 35 years in the armed forces before becoming the ambassador to Afghanistan, so I feel compelled to tell you one story before I get started with my prepared remarks, and that's the story of 2 individuals who are in a hot air balloon. And let me step away from this. Can you still hear if I'm standing here? I'll probably walk back and forth then. It's the story of 2 individuals that are in a hot air balloon, and they're making a cross-country trip across the United States, and they want to do this with the traditional navigation means, so they have no GPS, and they catch a good wind current, and they're making great time, but they're above a cloud cover. So after several hours of moving fast, the navigator turns to the pilot and says, I don't have a good fix on where we are, and I recommend that we drop below the cloud cover and I'll get a fix. And the pilot says, good idea. So they drop below the cloud cover, and as they emerge, they look below, and there's this huge building, and it's surrounded by an even bigger parking lot. And so the navigator leans over the gondola, and he sees somebody walk into their car in this large parking lot, and he shouts the question, "Where are we?" And this individual, getting into his car, looks up and says, "You're in a hot air balloon." And so they rise back through the cloud cover, and they're drifting again. And the navigator's very excited, and he turns to the pilot, and he says, "I know where we are. We're over the Pentagon, Washington, D.C." And the pilot says, "From that answer, how could you possibly know that?" And he said, "Well, you think about that answer. It was concise, it was accurate, and it was of no help whatsoever." So that's my military background story. And what I hope to do today is to be concise and be accurate, but unlike the fellow in the parking lot there, be of some help to you. So what I'd like to do is, following up on what I know is one of the very explicit goals that you have in ESF, which is to help you imagine how you can use educational opportunities to create vital and productive lives from yourself. That's lifted directly from the so-called mission statement of ESF. So I'm going to make an effort to help contribute to you to realize that goal. Now, a point of clarification, I use the term public service in the title of my talk, but in this instance, I know that when we talk about public service, I have an Army career, I have a shorter diplomatic career, but public service extends far beyond government and military careers, and I want to emphasize this point up front. Assignments and substantive actions taken for the betterment of one's community, whether local, whether national, whether international, whether working for profits, for nonprofits, all of these can meet the definition of public service. There's a very famous quote from Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis. He once said, "The most important public office is that of the private citizen." So I'm talking very expansively now about public service. My prepared remarks then are in three parts. I'd like to first give a little bit more relevant background about myself. Second, I'd like to draw upon my own personal experiences and provide you with examples of how and why I believe that the liberal arts education is an indispensable commodity if you do wish to engage in public service. And third, give you a few thoughts on the pursuit of your undergraduate education here at Stanford. So let's get started. First, a little bit more about myself to provide context for the remainder of my remarks, but also perhaps for the conversation to follow. As Blair had said, I'm the beneficiary of a pretty extensive liberal arts education. My undergraduate studies were completed at West Point, United States Military Academy, most recently the site of its football team's defeat by Stanford on September the 15th of this year by a score of 34-20, but I've recovered from that. And I majored at the United States Military Academy, not in engineering, but in economics and in Mandarin Chinese. So, again, as Blair had said, I have 2 master's degrees from Harvard University and from Stanford. I spent a year as a national security fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School, and then I have an advanced degree in Chinese ancient history from Nanjing University in the People's Republic of China. This adds up to, as I said, a considerable amount of time in liberal arts programs. Of course, I also attended military schools along the way, including West Point, which provided scientific, engineering, and technical skills really essential for the profession of arms. Over 100 years ago, the very famous German sociologist Max Weber wrote about the so-called polar opposites in education. Talked about the arts and humanities versus science and engineering, more technical skills. In comparing these two supposed polar opposites, he used terms and expression such as inquiring insight versus information, knowledge versus skill, inspiration versus discipline, and learning for its own sake versus learning for utility. Contrasts which can be overdrawn and frequently are overdrawn but I find very useful nevertheless. Weber himself concluded that these two so-called polar opposites do not really stand opposed. And in my own experience, it is that any good institution of higher learning must ensure that students are required to study both. Of course, there are occasions over the span of a life and a professional career in which you'll find the boundaries between Weber's polar opposites rather well documented. I remember when I was much younger, at age 24, when I was a junior infantry officer and was leading a platoon of 40 soldiers in a very elite U.S. Army Ranger Battalion, equivalent of a commando unit. And it was on an exercise in Germany during the Cold War. We were participating. It was a very grueling and a realistic training exercise. So late one very chilly, very cold October night in the Bavarian countryside, I was awoken and learned that a British Special Forces commando unit that was simulating Soviet's commando Spetsnaz forces, that this unit was on the move. So I rousted my platoon of 40 Rangers, and we quickly jumped on board transport helicopters. We flew several hundred kilometers across the German countryside, and we got to where we were heading, to a big bridge spanning a river where we anticipated then this British unit, simulating that they were Soviet commandos, would have to cross the bridge if they were going to move on to what we expected was their target, which was a German nuclear reactor. So after I positioned my soldiers in this ambush position, I conferred with a very seasoned platoon sergeant. A platoon sergeant is the senior enlisted man in an infantry platoon, and he was very, very seasoned. Multiple tours of duty in Afghanistan. He was a high school graduate. He had not gone beyond high school education, and very typical of the Army at that time, and still somewhat typical of the Army today. So I have to tell you that he didn't know a lot about Max Weber, probably had not heard of him, didn't know about the polar opposites of education, but he knew a lot about soldiering, and he knew a lot about leadership, about which I was to learn more as I was to advance in my career. So here we are in this pre-GPS era, and I finally got time to look at my map and see which river is this. And I was excited because I'm looking at the German map, and it says that we are sitting on the Donau River, and Donau is the Danube River. So here I am on the Danube River, and this magnificent, romantic, moving body of water that I've read so much about, sitting in the Bavarian countryside. So I turn to my platoon sergeant, Staff Sergeant Rahl, and say, Sergeant Rahl, this is the Danube River. And he said, sir, what's the point? I said, well, Staff Sergeant Rahl, the Danube River, Johann Strauss Jr.'s The Blue Danube Waltz. And he stared at me and said, Lieutenant, Blue Danube, Red Danube, all I know right now is that I'm pretty damn cold. And so as I too stood there shivering on the banks of this very poetic Danube River, I understood that while the liberal arts education could offer knowledge and provide insights and inspire, one should be nevertheless discriminating in its application. I tell this story mostly in jest, but it is a rather extreme example. But the fact is that specialized training, and expert training, be it in medicine, law, or business, or as a soldier, in my mind, is absolutely rudderless unless you're grounded in and informed by a broad liberal arts education. Let me illustrate. Recently, I listened to an interview on a local public broadcasting station of the president of a company that I won't name here in Silicon Valley, and it was manufacturing software programs for use by the Department of Defense, and these software programs in turn were used by the United States Air Force to train the operators of remotely piloted vehicles, in other words, drones. They used these training programs then to get more skilled in tracking suspected terrorists and, when ordered, to actually fire missiles at these terrorists. Now, the software company president, he was truly a brilliant man. He was articulate. He was very, very witty, a young person. And I looked at this, and I was absolutely confident that his company is really helping the United States Air Force produce highly skilled drone operators. But what I was troubled with is this. At no point in his conversation, at no point in this 1-hour conversation, did he even indirectly touch upon ethical responsibilities, either in terms of the employment of the drones or the negative psychological impact on operators, which we are discovering to be very, very significant. So now let's compare that story with the so-called father of the atomic bomb, Robert J. Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer, while he was a graduate, an undergraduate at Harvard University, he not only studied mathematics and science, but he also pursued intellectual interest in English and French literature and studied philosophy of Eastern religions. Oppenheimer recollected during an interview some years after the successful testing of the atomic bomb on the 17th of July, 1945, saying at the time of the explosion, and I'll quote, "We knew the world would not be the same. A few people laughed, a few people cried. Most were silent. I remembered the line," still quoting from Oppenheimer, "I remember the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, which Oppenheimer, by the way, could read in Sanskrit. And the quote, Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he could do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. 1 week after learning of the intended second dropping of the atomic bomb on Nagasaki, Oppenheimer traveled to Washington, D.C. to hand-deliver a letter to the Secretary of War, Stimson, expressing his revulsion and desire to see no further use of nuclear weapons. We don't know, but I expect that it was Oppenheimer's liberal arts education and his passion of philosophy and ethics that helped shape his grave concerns over the morality of atomic weaponry and their future use. So, living in a world as we do, in which the potential power of science and engineering seems to know absolutely no limits now, or high finance and big banking decisions can have catastrophic human consequences, I do believe that we are much better served through a wide teaching of the liberal arts, which Max Weber also described as helping the student to acquire a new soul. Or, as the American sociologist, the historian, and the civil rights activist W.E.B. Du Bois once wrote, quote, education and work are levers to uplift people. Work alone will not do it unless inspired by the right ideals and guided by intelligence. Education must not simply teach work, it must teach life. So now let me turn to the second part of my presentation. And I'd like to address with you then the question, how does a liberal arts education with emphasis on the humanities and the social sciences best prepare individuals, best prepare students for effective public service at home and abroad? I'll answer this question now by speaking in terms of disciplines and recounting different vignettes from the course of my own professional career. Let's start with the discipline of history. I can count on one hand, or two hands, maybe at the most, my really significant lifetime mentors and deep sources of inspiration, something I'll come back to in a moment. Now, my own short list, it includes the late Professor J. Louvas, who taught advanced military history when I was a cadet at West Point at the United States Military Academy. At that time, Professor Luvas J. was one of the very few civilian instructors at the military academy. And that's changed since those days. So one day, when I was as a senior cadet now, wearying of my studies and preparing for graduation and anticipating what would be my first assignment in the field, leading an infantry platoon in the Republic of Korea, I asked Professor Luvas after class how his lectures might help me in the days ahead, far from the classroom where I would be serving. So he replied, well, Mr. Eikenberry, Cadet Eikenberry, the answer to your specific question is not much. The military profession is both an art and it's a science. And what I've been teaching you is the art. But he went on to say this, Karl, let me suggest, though, that one of the many things you hopefully can take with you from this class is perspective and context. In the coming years, you're going to be called upon to lead soldiers in combat. I know of no more demanding and stressful work or lonely task. But remember, no matter how difficult the situation will be, commanders over the millennia have been there before you, whether that be Xenophon leading his 10,000 Greeks against the Persians, whether that be Wellington commanding his troops at Waterloo, whether that be Ulysses Grant commanding the army at Vicksburg. And he went on to say, so to be sure, there's different technologies, the geography is different each time, so is the weather, the mission, and indeed the odds that you face. But one constant for military leaders at all levels, from the junior level to the strategic level, is that they were all placed under extraordinary stress and experienced extraordinary loneliness. And yet, they often survived, and they often found ways to prevail. Historically speaking, at least, Karl, you'll never be alone. So J. Luvas became, at that point, and from that point on, he became one of my life's spiritual companions, but I was never to see Professor Luvas after I graduated. But I took Professor Luvas's words and his wisdom with me through life, whether I was serving as that platoon leader then, commanding 40 soldiers in the Republic of Korea, commanding 25,000 soldiers in Afghanistan, leading a pretty large-scale United States embassy in Kabul during the surge. Throughout those periods of time, I always remembered Professor Luvas's words when things got very, very tough. He was always there to offer me reassurance. Another point from history. When people ask me to name the greatest deficiency in formulating our strategies and policies in Iraq and Afghanistan over the past decade, my reply is always the same. The absence of rigorous thinking in time, as Harvard professor Richard Neustadt would have said. An appreciation of the historical context and perspective can help more levels of ambition and distinguish between the transient ripple and the rhythmic tide. It can also help contain the impulse towards hubris. So I'm not suggesting that if we had had historians at the table, we would have ended up necessarily with better policy choices in Iraq and Afghanistan. But I have to tell you, after more than 12 years of war, trillions of dollars of resources spent in those campaigns, many, many lives lost, even more terribly damaged, it's hard to imagine how the appropriate application of the discipline of history could have made things worse. Let me turn to archaeology and museums. You might be surprised to know that over the course of my years of service in Afghanistan, that I found the two most cost-effective United States-sponsored government projects to be, one, the restoration of the great citadel of Herat at one of the gates of Persia called Iqtiyad-Ruddin, whose origins actually go back to the time of Alexander the Great, and the second project, the renovation of the Afghan National Museum, which was located in Kabul, which included, by the way, the provision of a very wonderful exhibit of artifacts of the pre-Islamic Gandhara civilization that flourished in southeastern and southern Afghanistan during the times of the latter Roman and early Byzantine empires. These were efforts that were priced at a few $1 million, not the tens and hundreds of millions of dollars, not the billions of dollars that we committed to massive development projects or to training and equipping the Afghan National Army and police, or for the biggest cost, just having soldiers deployed to Afghanistan at the cost of $1 million a year. We've got 100,000 soldiers there. That's a lot of money. Instead, for those few $1 million, though, we got some really remarkable dividends. First, they offered the people of Afghanistan, who had been traumatized after decades of conflict and chaos, evidence of a very rich culture and prior days of glory. It gave them confidence. With displays of some facts and some myths, the Herat Citadel and the National Museum of Afghanistan are very much part of the foundation, I believe, in which a more stable and prosperous Afghanistan must be built. They made, and they make, incredible contributions as well to the promotion of national unity within that country. So turning on the head, the words of the very infamous Nazi playwright Hans Jost, one might hopefully say, when I hear the word gun, I reach for my culture. Second, these two projects serve as great American legacy. The Afghan people, when they look at the restored Citadel of Herat, when they see the revitalized National Museum of Afghanistan, they catch a glimpse of an America that has been, in parts of the world, quite literally obscured by the fog of war. Indeed, over time, as our chief of mission in Kabul, I came to regard our embassy's cultural heritage program manager, that is our embassy's archaeological specialist, as one of the most high-impact members of our team. That's saying a lot. We had 18 departments and agencies in that embassy. We had a big Treasury Department, a big Drug Enforcement Administration Department. You name it, it was there. And yet I looked at our one archaeologist as one of the high-impact members of that entire team. By the way, she was only one of 2 archaeologists that we have in embassies around the world today. Third discipline, music. When I was the ambassador in 2009, our embassy was able to make some modest contributions to the startup of what's called the Afghan National Institute of Music in Kabul. It's a great institution that provides instruction in Western and traditional Afghan music to youth regardless of means. So earlier this year, I was invited from Stanford to attend a conference performed by some of the Institute's orchestra, these young children, at the Kennedy Performing Arts Center in Washington, D.C. I have to tell you that that concert, that event, turned out to be one of the most powerful and emotional events of my entire life. The sense of pride that was engendered in that conference, in that concert, among the many Afghan nationals who were attending and Afghan Americans who were attending, it was simply overwhelming. And while no one in the audience, I know, left the Kennedy Center that evening with a definitive answer to the question about whether Afghanistan, as U.S. and NATO troops now begin to withdraw in bigger numbers, everyone in that audience was absolutely convinced that in the right environment, the Afghan people, they can and they will excel on the world stage. No pun intended here. Separately, I visited Singapore not long ago, and I met with an old friend of mine, Ambassador Tommy Koh. I don't think that that Ambassador Koh would mind me or object to me divulging this part of our conversation, which I will. Given my background with government and with military service, I asked him what I'm sure he found the very predictable question: how can the United States of America, Ambassador Koh, improve its standing in Singapore and in Southeast Asia? So I, of course, had expected Ambassador Koh then to respond by digging into details of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement or the specifics of U.S. military posture in the Asia-Pacific region. What was his answer? Very unexpected. He said, send the New York Philharmonic Orchestra. Now, the meaning was clear. It really wasn't about the Philharmonic Symphony Society of New York, as it's properly called, or even exclusively about music. It was about deploying, and sorry to use the military expression there, it was about deploying soft power, American soft power. Victor Hugo wrote, music expresses that which cannot be said and on which it is impossible to be silent. So I take music here as very representative of the humanities, and I agree with Hugo. What they offer often cannot be expressed, but they cannot be left silent. America's historical advocacy of the humanities and liberal arts has been a very great source of our international appeal. And as a nation, or as individuals, I believe we retreat from this advocacy at a great cost. Last, on the study of languages. One of my favorite life stories dates back to the fall of 2002 and occurred shortly after I had arrived in Kabul for my first tour of duty in Afghanistan. I was surprised when the Secretary of Defense, about a month before, had called me into his office and asked me the question, how would I like to go to Afghanistan and build the new Afghan National Army? And he was the Secretary of Defense, and I said, of course, I'd be delighted. And so a month later, I was in Kabul. I knew very little about Afghanistan, what I could learn in a month of reading and talking with people. But when I got to Afghanistan then, I did what I'm sure that you would do, and you're trying to learn about a situation and environment, so you just start meeting with people. And one of the people that I met with, the many Afghans that I met with, was Brigadier General Asifi, commander of the Afghan Border Police. And we were having dinner in the Khyber restaurant in Kabul, and I was accompanied by my interpreter, Dr. Najib. And Dr. Najib was a good young interpreter, and he was probably operating usually at about 98% precision, but we weren't negotiating with the Afghans a nuclear non-proliferation agreement, so 98% was plenty good. And he was even better because when it came to trying to get emotions and feelings and anger, he had a very uncanny sense of being able to interpret that through expression, even better than the monologue, monotone interpreter in that way. So I'm sitting down with General Asifi, and I said, General Asifi, tell me about Afghanistan. So General Asifi really warmed to this, and he got very excited, and he was telling me about culture, history, and I could tell as he's getting more excited, Dr. Najib's accuracy was starting to come down, but that was okay. And so we got to what I know was the culminating point for General Asifi, and he, working through my interpreter now, is just very excited, and my interpreter says, General Asifi has just said, now listen to this, General Asifi has just said that we Afghans have a long and proud tradition of inviting foreigners to our country and then hospitalizing them. Now, the fact is that I think that 12 years after that, or some 11 years after that point, that I think what Dr. Najib meant to translate was, and inviting them to our country and then showing them great hospitality. The fact is that 11 years later, I'm still not certain, and that shows the limit of my knowledge. So superficially, this is a story about the importance of accurate translations. But that's the superficial point here, the deeper point. It does, at another level, I think, demonstrate the critical ancillary skills associated with proficiency in one or more foreign languages. I did not speak Dari. I speak Mandarin Chinese as a second language. I believe those who can speak a foreign language with some degree of competency learn the art of carefully listening to others, an art that escapes many Americans abroad who mostly specialize in transmitting. General Asifi was genuinely very grateful to share a meal with an American general who listened. And as well, those who master languages, I believe, are much more sensitive to the need for clarity of verbal communications, even when working through an interpreter in a language that they don't understand themselves. And perhaps even more important, they're better attuned towards cross-cultural communications. It was once explained to me by a professor when I was at Nanjing University that if I spoke no Chinese, I'd be a window shopper admiring goods on display inside the store through the window. If I went further and learned the language, he said I'd be able to enter the store and look around. But he said, if you go beyond this and learn the culture well, made accessible in part, of course, through a knowledge of foreign language, but not a prerequisite, that I'd be invited by the shop owner, so to speak, into the back room to see the store's real treasures. I'd submit that the surprise that attended the suddenness and the scope of the Arab Spring to our people, to our government, indicates the need to have a greater number serving in government and relevant policy circles who can go beyond metaphorical window shopping. And I believe that it's only with the humanities and the social sciences enabled part by language competency that can give one entree and access to the store. So what I've done here is I've provided you with a smorgasbord of life experiences, so to speak, in an effort to illustrate to you how the liberal arts education have impacted my work in public service in ways that are not always obvious. But while the contribution, of course, has been very difficult to measure precisely, I know that it has been quite significant. So let me conclude now with the third part of my talk, and I'd offer 4 unsolicited thoughts on the pursuit of your undergraduate education here at Stanford in the form of suggestions. First, one of the most understated aspects, I believe, of the rigorous liberal arts education, and specifically the humanities, is its emphasis on reasoning logically and testing what one reads or they say for consistency of reasoning, correctness of fact, and accuracy of judgment. It provides a very unique opportunity to improve one's critical analytical skills and abilities to present orally and in writing. I can't overstate to you how valued these assets are both in public and in the private domain. As a senior military commander, as the ambassador in Afghanistan, as I would go into those assignments, I would scour those organizations and make an effort to locate the really good thinkers, the best writers, and the best presenters. They were and they remain, and I think for years to come, they will remain rare and prized commodities. I went so far when I was the U.S. coalition commander in Afghanistan to always choose a British Army colonel to lead our strategy and plans division, because this division was required frequently, sometimes daily, to write concise and clear memos that would be read by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Secretary of Defense, and the President of the United States. So why choose a British Army colonel? It's because the British, in their own schoolhouses, still emphasize the construction of cogent essays. And their skills, these British Army officers, their skills, they simply stood out. And lest you think this is some quirky opinion by me, this volume of memos that we would have going to Washington, D.C., or to headquarters U.S. Central Command, I would frequently be asked by civilian and military leaders, who's writing these essays? Because they just stood out. And I would reply, well, maybe at that particular time, well, it's Colonel George Lauder, British Army. And they'd look back at me and says, it makes sense, I understand. So if you want to contribute to the public good, I would suggest that you learn to think, write, and speak critically, concisely, and clearly. And the liberal arts education, in my own way of thinking, uniquely develops this capacity. Second, I'd urge you to continue to devote much time to learning about your own country, meaning the United States of America, for most of you here, but certainly not all. I especially say these words to this gathering of Stanford undergraduates because I expect most of you will ultimately pursue careers that bring you into contact with the world beyond your nation's borders. And you'll likely serve as bridges, trying to connect your own country to others. I have no doubt that those of you who determine early that your post-Stanford endeavors are going to take you to distant shores, that you're going to use your time to study foreign languages, international relations and economics, comparative politics and development, and world history. I'm also confident that you'll ensure that as a metaphorical bridge, you're grounded on the far side of the shore with that kind of curriculum. However, a bridge must be well sited on both sides of the shore if it's going to serve as an effective span. And understanding your own nation and your society is absolutely critical if you want to perform that role. I can tell you that after serving many years in China, that never on one occasion did I have a Chinese diplomat or officer of the People's Liberation Army look at me and say, "General, can you tell me all you know about our great novel, The Romance of the Three Kingdoms?" Or did they ever ask me to what I knew about Beijing opera? But I know something about both as it is. However, what they did always ask me are questions like this. How does my government operate? Explain what's going on. Explain the rationale for the U.S. global and Asia-Pacific strategy. Why do you Americans emphasize human rights as an element of your foreign policy? Those questions, my mastery of Mandarin Chinese, my degree from Nanjing University in ancient Chinese history, they were of little help at that point in time. In our desire to explore the distant horizon, often we overlook our own backyard. I recall the words of Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy, Stanford class of 1958, as you know, quote, "We need education and some basic values of democratic responsibility. You don't take a DNA test to see if you believe in democracy. It's taught. Democracy must be preserved. It must be transmitted. It must be defended. You can't preserve something that you do not understand. You can't transmit something that you haven't learned. You cannot defend what you do not know." So, knowing who you are and how to define your nation is essential if you want to serve as that metaphorical international bridge. And this can only be done through the study of the humanities and the social sciences. My suggestion then is to take at least a few courses while here to learn the terrain on the near side of the river. Third, on mentors. Webster defines a mentor as a wise and a faithful counselor. Interestingly, the term derived from Greek mythology. Mentor is the name of the loyal friend and advisor of Homer's Odysseus, the teacher of Odysseus' son. All of you here have heard about the importance of mentors in helping you make the right professional, family, and ethical choices through life. And I recommend you choose mentors both well and sparingly. Homer did not write about Odysseus' network of mentors. He only wrote about one profound mentor. In the years ahead here at Stanford, I recommend that you stay alert. Which faculty members here possess the life experiences and the values that you admire? Who cares about your welfare and your development? Who is willing to give you advice that may not be pleasing to your ears? In my mind, if you do select carefully, your list of valued mentors will probably be a short one. But remember that you also have a responsibility in maintaining relationships with your mentors. I'm sure that while you're here at Stanford, each one of you will have 1, 2, 3, 4 professors who's going to make a very profound difference in your education. Don't admire them from a distance, graduate, and then one day, some years later, send them suddenly a bolt out of the blue email saying, "Dear Professor X, sorry to bother you. Applying to law school and have attached 6 letters of recommendation forms that are due tomorrow. Thank you in advance. Hope all is well. Best, Karl." Truly, I know that there's a natural concern that potential mentors for you, you'd look at them as probably busy people, better not to trouble them unless necessary. But I can tell you that if you do choose your mentors well and wisely, they're people that find nothing more rewarding in life than to hear from those who they've coached and counseled, knowing that they've made a difference. Stay in touch at Stanford and then beyond with those who you admire and whose advice matters. Fourth and final point before we turn to questions. You've been provided tremendous opportunities by the virtue of your selection to attend this great institution and by your family finding the material means for you to do so. Most of you are destined to become leaders in American society or in the countries that you come from in very many different walks of life. Upon leaving this campus for the freshmen here in 2017, you'll start to assume positions outside this campus in which your actions and your decisions are going to impact the livelihood of others that have not had your fortune. Indeed, you will be impacting and defining their very sense of self-worth. Pretty heady stuff. Who we are is a product of our environment, the expectations of those in our circle, and our own choices. As said, you're extraordinarily blessed during very important formative years for you to dwell in this remarkable environment called Stanford University. And you benefit and will benefit from faculty, and I expect from parents, who have had high expectations of your performance, motivating you to push the envelope and reach for your potential. Now what I would ask you, commit yourselves now to extend your own fortune in the years ahead to those who are going to rely upon you in the workplace and at home. Learn how to establish good environments and set your expectations of others very high. Believe in those entrusted to your care so that they will believe in themselves. And I'm confident, from my own experience at least, that you can best find the guidelines and the inspiration to do so through a rich liberal arts education. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions. Sure.
I don't think we have a microphone for you, so when you stand up to ask a question, if you would please just really speak loudly and make sure that all the students in the room can hear you as well, that would be terrific. And if people are a little quiet, you may want to repeat the question.
Great. Okay, well, we'll do.
And Karl will simply field questions from you himself.
Please.
Seeking a broad education in numerous subjects as well as a way of thinking that allows the recipients to think free and question information that's presented to them. And my question was that from the outside at least, the military seems to directly conflict with this view as it seems it seems to rely on people simply following orders and questioning. And I wanted to know what your view on that was and the conflict between a liberal education and a military culture.
It's a great question. Did everybody hear it? The question, if I get this right, if I don't get it right, please correct me. The question was that as I talked about liberal arts education and the benefits that come with it, that the military culture, which I come from, is not necessarily a culture in which the liberal arts education, as I've defined it here with all the benefits that come from it, is really appreciated. It's more of a hierarchical organization, and that it's more of a just salute and say yes, sir, and go out and get the job done. Is that encapsulated? Yeah. What I would tell you is that the the United States military and the great militaries of the world today, they're really not that kind of organization at all. It's pretty, there's been a very profound change that's occurred in our militaries and the way that we organize and the way that we actually then work our way through decision making and leadership. The military has had great changes over the last 50 years. We've gone from a very hierarchical organization to a much more networked approach towards military operations. And when I say networked, I mean networked not just with Army, Navy, Air Force, but networked with the civilian agencies of the United States government. It's an organization in which is extraordinarily decentralized now. If you look at the kind of operations that we were conducting in Afghanistan and Iraq. Having said that, there still is a risk within military organizations that they can take a kind of mental paradigm and apply it to a particular operation, and that they can get fixated then on a particular way of looking at a problem. Our military does a great job of planning, and they have a great competency in this. But there's also times in recent history where, after initially sizing up what we thought the problem was and perhaps having a pretty accurate assessment, that not very agile and getting fixated, as I said, on a particular framework. The last thing I would say, though, is that if you're looking at the United States military's officer corps right now, it's a group that is probably as well educated, probably better formally educated than most counterpart civilian organizations. Our military has been very generous in terms of developing officers over the decades, and a lot of that education has been in the liberal arts and the social sciences. Please.
And I was wondering if you had the opportunity to give liberal arts education to the enlisted soldiers that you were leading, how would they react to it?
I gave the story. Of when I was a young lieutenant in the mid-1970s. We have a different Army than that Army. Our Army today, the enlisted soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, they have a higher level of education than we had in the 1970s and even the 1980s. We made a transition in the early 1970s from a draft military to a volunteer, and then as each year passed, we started to realize that we would need to have different sets of incentives to attract and retain soldiers, sailor, airmen, Marines that would be able to operate competently in the very complex military environments which our forces go. So, point number one is you'll end up then with go back to that platoon of 40 soldiers, and now you'll have some that are high school graduates, some 2 years of college. A lot of your sergeants that you will have a college education. So different in that regard. And in fact, what you end up with is now a lot of young men and women who have graduated from high school or maybe went off to 2 years of college, and they wanted to go off and do something else, and they were also attracted by the idea that when they went off and did something else, that they would be getting then education benefits. So they will enlist, they'll stay in for 4 years usually, 5 years, and get out, and then they'll have a pretty sizable scholarship money that's available from the United States government to draw upon. Please.
What was the difference and how was the transition from a military career to a diplomatic career? And how did the level of education that you had help you transition?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I left military service in 2009, in late April, and was retired at the Pentagon by our chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at that time, Admiral Mike Mullen. And the very next day, I went across the Potomac River, and I was standing on the 7th floor of the Department of State, and Secretary of State, then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, swore me in as our ambassador to Afghanistan. So I had 24 hours of retirement from federal service. And retirement from federal service, I can tell you, based upon that 24 hours, is vastly overrated. As I went in as the ambassador to Afghanistan, what did I have to think about? Well, one of the real concerns I had as I'm trying to put together this massive U.S. embassy was to become the largest U.S. embassy we've had in the history of the United States, with the largest development budget we've ever had in the history of the United States on a bilateral basis, $4.2 billion. What was I thinking about? Well, I was having to give a lot of time to think about leading the team, managing the team. This was an organizational, managerial leadership task. Had 18 departments and agencies in that embassy, as I said. So my concern was going in that this civilian team would expect me to come walking up to the United States Embassy, having had a 35-year military career, and probably expect me to be wearing a helmet and a ill-fitting pinstripe suit, and my first business of the day would be tell everybody to get down and start doing push-ups. That's what I was worried about. So I had to think hard going in about making sure that whatever my approach was, that I didn't have people saying, this guy still thinks he's a general. And yet against that, you've got to move fast. You have to set standards in a very different environment. I found that at the end of the day, though, the basic principles of leadership, keeping what I said in mind, the very basic principles of leadership, they were as applicable in the United States Embassy as they were in a military command. Finding ways to bring a team together, to build unity and cohesion, to be looked at as a person that would stand up and be heard. I'll give you one vignette that maybe makes this point. The President asked for a memorandum from me before he made his final decision on the surge, and the Secretary of State asked for a memorandum. What are your opinions? Straight, not to be coordinated with anybody. What are you thinking? Because I had had a good amount of time in Afghanistan. So I wrote a memorandum which was at variance with the military command's views. And that cable, unfortunately, that I sent back to Washington, D.C. was leaked in the New York Times in December, and then the full leak and disclosure came in January. So I returned to the United States Embassy from consultations in Washington, D.C., and this cable had now leaked. It was out there in the public. And when I wrote that cable, there was only 3 people beyond me in the United States Embassy that knew of that cable, because we had to keep it, as we say, very compartmentalized. 3 people. So a lot of people didn't know about it. I returned to the embassy, and I had a Department of State diplomat walk up to me and shook my hand and said, I just want to shake your hand, Ambassador. Why? And he said, well, I read the cable in the New York Times, and Ambassador, I'm not telling you whether I agree or disagree, but I do know one thing. From your standpoint, you were speaking truth to power at that point in time, and I know that was not a real popular thing for you to do. So I'd been taught as a young State Department diplomat, he went on to say, that we're in the business to report with integrity. And I found that that was a huge turning point for me in terms of trying to take the embassy and rally them behind me in one unified effort. So how does liberal arts and education help in all of this? Some of the anecdotes vignettes I was giving before, to spend some time here at Stanford and think about ethics, think about these dilemmas. I I could have taken another view. I could have taken the view this surge is going to go forward. I don't want to kill my relationship with the military. If I do this, we're going to be at loggerheads. So just water this thing down. It wasn't preordained that I should write that cable, but I will tell you that sitting around and talking about ethical problems, responsibilities, it can help. And as I said, at times to know that you shouldn't be too lonely, because people have been there in situations that are a heck of a lot more difficult than the one you're in. Please.
Regarding morality, especially with the private or the person that's really down on the field with the trigger, do we want them? Should we enforce that they also are learning the morality and the gravity of their situation?
That's a great question, too. These are excellent questions. I demand easier questions. Yeah, that's a very important question. What I would tell you is that there's an enormous effort that's put in our military, truly, into ethical training for soldiers, for leaders at all levels. A lot of work that's put into it. We try to create systems also that as the rules are taught, that there's ways to make sure that they're enforced. Warfare is pretty ugly business when it's being prosecuted. And at the end of the day, warfare is a human endeavor. And humans are frail, and there is no more difficult, challenging task than being in combat. As I said earlier, warfare has changed also to where it's today at least, it will probably change over in cycles of time, but it's very decentralized now. So you end up with small units that are operating all across Afghanistan or previously Iraq. And how do you maintain then your eyes on all of this? A couple of points. First of all, that you might find it surprising that I believe that the media has a very important role in trying to get at what you're talking about. How do you ensure the morality and in the performance of our forces that are in combat? And the media can play a very important role. Warfare is ugly business. What the media can do, they can shine lights on ugly business going on. And so as difficult as a commander and ambassador as it would be to work with the media, I came by my third tour of duty to love to have the media out there looking at everything and reporting. And occasionally you're going to get a very unpleasant surprise, but that's okay. It's a warning indicator that something is potentially going wrong. The second point that I'd make in terms of ethics and soldier performance in combat, that you'll find that we as a people, and with the values that we take forward, that these get inculcated and reflected in our armed forces as well. I'll tell you of a conversation that I had with a special operations major some years ago in Uruzgan province. And I was a commanding general, and I sat down with this major, and he wanted to talk, so we talked and talked. And as he talked about the dilemma that he was in this very difficult place of Afghanistan, where he was fighting and allied with a police chief and an army command in Afghanistan, which was probably a very corrupt group, he looked at me and said, "You know, I got to say, General, on a bad day here, I don't know whether I'm fighting on the right side here or not." And there's no specific answer to your question. It's a matter of education. It's a matter of trying to get checks and balances built in and trying to instill rules and appreciation for the rules of land warfare. And there's also then the aspect of just making sure that the people in your command, beyond the rules, that they remain true to the values of our country. Please.
Earlier you mentioned that a liberal arts education education will be able to help one prevail under extraordinary stress and loneliness. Can you talk further about this? I was wondering, is it because with a liberal arts education you can see a bigger picture and that gives one comfort in a situation where they're alone?
Yeah, I think in my mind, it's a matter of, said, historical context, that there can be, if you're not grounded in history, you can lead yourself to believe that the situation you are in is very novel and no one has ever been there before. It's not that a study of history of the liberal arts will give you then a recipe book that given any particular situation you're going to be in life, I can refer to this, and this gives me the specific answer. But it can give you reassurance. I said it can give you a degree of context. On the other hand, getting unmoored from history can lead, as I also said, to hubris. Please.
Many other universities in America, we have the privilege of obtaining liberal arts education. But at environments where liberal education isn't provided, what are some other alternative means of obtaining the same end goals of liberal education?
If you're not in a university? Yeah. One is the most apparent, I think, is reading, to maintain a very, as you go through Stanford here and you start to develop your more lifelong interest, to make sure that you also are spending time thinking about different domains that you'd like to be studying, and then to embark on life of a good, well thought out reading program. You know, when I was serving in the military and when I was serving as our ambassador in Afghanistan, there were certain areas that I never had time to explore. And these were important areas such as world economics, not understanding what's going on financially in the United States. So when I came here to Stanford, I immediately began a lot of reading in those areas. I'd encourage you all through your life, though, to not only read technically about whatever profession you're in, but to think more broadly through the liberal arts and to do that. Secondly, finding opportunities to explore different fields and areas in ways that could include going to lectures, trips that you want to sign up for, friends that you want to meet with. One of the great things about the liberal arts education is that it provides the opportunity for you in life to take a lot of different disciplines and then to draw upon them in ways that can be very surprising in terms of good outcomes. So that if you're a computer engineer, but you've developed eclectic interest in many different areas of the liberal arts and the humanities, these will give you surprising insights that can be very powerful. Final point is, there's increasingly in our society, there are fewer and fewer problems that are single discipline. We have interdisciplinary approaches. That means putting together interdisciplinary teams in order to address these. And so by keeping your eyes and ears open, whether it be through reading, contacts, how you manage your time of going to different lectures, that can also create in your mind then and your skills the ability to look at particular problems, knowing that this goes beyond my functional expertise. What kind of team do I need to put together? Please, in the green back there.
Hi, I'm Julia. And I once read a book by a man named Eric Greitens called The Heart and the Fist, and he's a Navy SEAL who later became a philanthropist and a Rhodes Scholar. And he talked about how during his undergraduate time at Karl University, he never really learned the type of discipline that he learned when he was serving the SEALs. And I was wondering, how do we sort of simulate this type of discipline in the liberal arts education? And furthermore, is one solution to require all U.S. citizens to serve in the military?
Yeah. Great question, too. I guess there's been a change in the rules of infantry and special forces, and by the time you graduate in 2017, the SEALs will be open to you if you want to go that route. But short of that route is your question. Serving in make 2 points. First of all, I think that the great education that you get here at Stanford can tell you if you use your 4 years widely, you're going to gain functional expertise in a particular domain that may be of interest as you start to work through your majors. There's the liberal arts benefit that I talked about, critical analysis, problem solving, struggling with issues of values and ethics. There's a third area, though, that I would suggest you keep in mind that necessarily universities don't do a great job of, and that is to help you gain an appreciation of how important it is to know what kind of institutional setting do you like working in, separate from is it about computer science, or is it about chemistry, or is it about teaching history? What kind of institutional setting do you like being in? Give you some examples of what I mean by this. I like leading organizations. I like leading organizations so only if it's got a mission that I truly believe in, or if I got to have the U.S. flag behind me. I don't mean that in a corny sense. I mean that I've enjoyed working in the military and the government. I like leading and managing. I also occasionally like to get away from the big organization, and I got opportunities in the military occasionally to go off to Harvard and Stanford and get away from all of that for a period of time. But knowing what kind of context you enjoy working in becomes very important in life. Do you like being the loner out there? Do you like being the solo entrepreneur? Do you like being in the bigger organization? Do you like serving within teams? What kind of missions do you like to be engaged with? And that comes on then to, so give some thought about that. I would also encourage then over the course of your time at Stanford, and to maybe get at your question about how do you then try to gain experiences where you can get that so-called discipline, or you get a better appreciation of working within organizations. I would suggest to you during your time at Stanford to do so. Take a summer internship with a embassy overseas. Take a summer internship with the Department of Defense or in the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. Get involved here at Stanford in some of the big student organizations where you're having to work as part of a larger team with a set of responsibilities. One that will give you some appreciation of what you're talking about, that the SEAL officer had experienced, but also it will give you, I think, some insights as you graduate and approach graduation from Stanford. What direction do you want to go? It's not only about functional expertise and your skills, it has to do with what kind of organizational domain and environment do you like to work in. That's it, please.
A while ago you mentioned how languages can improve sensitivity and like your compassion when talking to other people. Is there any other way to like develop that, or is it solely through like learning a language where you can develop this like sensitivity to listen to other people?
No, I think that language is a great way. I think it's a I think it's a huge derivative benefit that comes with that, but the need to how do you develop the listening skills that can be developed, of course, in the academic environment here at Stanford. To develop that skill to listen carefully to what's being set up here on the platform in your different associations with other students. That becomes something that can be learned. I know that Stanford also, one of the many great things about the curriculum here, they use the team problem-solving approach. And to look and to join classes that are team problem-solving approaches, that's something that can also, I believe, deliver those skills to you over time. And then ask people to give you honest feedback.
I know that a number of you have to start getting to classes soon, so I think we should just take one last question. So that
Who's got the easiest question? Okay, very quickly, because I know you got to go to classes. I was in my senior year at attending Goldsboro High School, Goldsboro, North Carolina. This is back in 1969, and I know I have to take 2 years of foreign language when I go to the military academy. At this time, Goldsboro, North Carolina, 1969, about 30,000 people. It is not the cultural center of the universe. And so I've got a letter from the Department of Foreign Languages. Mr. Eikenberry, you have to sign up for 2 years of foreign language. Please give us your choice. And I'd send them the letter back. So I'm looking at it, and first choice, French. I'm taking French here in Goldsboro High. Boring. German, that's a little bit more interesting. Spanish, Portuguese, I don't know. Then there's Russian. I said, Russian? Wow. Cold War, Russian, that's good. And then I look at the last choice, Mandarin Chinese. And I'm sitting in my room in our home in Goldsboro, North Carolina, looking out the window, and my dad's taken me to a Chinese restaurant once in my life, and I said, this is so exotic. That's my first choice. Now, that's a true story, and then I got hooked on it, and there were more choices that followed that, but I stayed with it. The point of the story, though, is that if you look at my CV, you might be able to conclude after reading the CV, man, this guy, when he came out of Goldsboro High School, he knew exactly where he was heading. He managed this every step of the way. He managed all of this. I did manage part of my career, but when I was leaving Goldsboro, North Carolina, I had no idea that I would be the ambassador to Afghanistan one day. What I did do faithfully, though, throughout my life, I tried to stay alert for possibilities. I tried to think hard all the time about where are my true interests. I read a lot. I tried to stay attuned to what was going on in the world. And when that contingency comes, that moment comes where there is an opportunity, at least you'll be able to recognize it as the opportunity. And with all the preparation, at least the door will be open. You don't have to walk through it, but at least the door will be open. And that's the point of that story. So thanks for asking it.